Welcome back. We are very privileged today to be joined by Max Blumenthal, an award-winning journalist and editor of The Gray Zone. So thank you for coming back on. I was hoping you can shed some light on what is happening now with this US push into Latin America. As we know, Washington outlined a lot of reasons why they had to attack Venezuela. They moved in, they killed a lot of people, kidnapped the president and his wife. Now there's a trial in New York. What is actually happening at the moment? It's very difficult for outsiders to get a clear overview over this massive mess.
Well, it's difficult and it's hard to call myself an insider, but it's difficult for me to get an understanding of just what the hell happened on January 3rd, which I kind of happened to be up late enough to virtually observe. It was in many ways a terrorist assault on Caracas. It was the kidnapping of the head of state and his wife, who, according to Diosdado Cabello, who is one of the most important power brokers in the Chavista movement, in an address last night, Celia Flores, First Lady of Venezuela, demanded to go with her husband as he was being kidnapped and may have saved his life in the process. Their presidential guard was mostly massacred. 32 Cuban officers were killed. Many civilians were killed as well, but apparently no U.S. loss of life. No helicopters were taken down. They were flying at 100 feet. So my first initial reaction was either a stunning military collapse on the Venezuelan side for an invasion that they'd been preparing for since 2005, and the CIA had been preparing for this as well, so much so that they telegraphed their plan for a halo, or like a high altitude lowering operation into Miraflores Palace in the Jack Ryan series, and explained exactly what they intended to do, which is what the Delta Force did where Nicolas Maduro was staying. And it just proceeded almost unimpeded. So I thought, this is probably some kind of military collapse, or Maduro was betrayed. And I think the first explanation is probably true. And I asked the former foreign minister of Venezuela, Jorge Ariasa, who is a confidant of the new acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, who I've interviewed in the past, and worked for Nicolas Maduro, knew him very well, and also knew Hugo Chavez, the sort of intellectual architect of the Bolivarian Revolution, so closely that he had married his daughter and was essentially a family spokesman. So a pretty well-placed person who fervently denied the idea that there had been some kind of betrayal or inside deal to sell out Maduro. And I think, at least based on everyone he knows, I take him at his word on that. Although, I mean, I have to take him at his word, and there's no evidence of any such thing, at least at a high level, or that it would have been possible to order some kind of military stand down from within the leadership of Venezuela without being exposed. And I just don't, and knowing those people, I don't, I just couldn't see that happening. There is deal making, which we'll talk about in a second, backroom deal making with the US, but that was always taking place under Maduro. So Ariasa openly admitted that their communication systems had been taken out. The US bombed the two major bases that would have allowed Venezuela to respond instantly, and bombed communication towers. They still have drones operating in Venezuelan airspace. And from that point on, there was no point in responding. And I think a question is, was there an order not to scramble the Sukhoi jets in a kind of counterattack? Because by that point, you would just be escalating the casualty count by engaging directly with the Americans. but so it was just a staggering failure of intelligence, counterintelligence, military, which allowed this to take place. At the same time, you have the evidence of a kind of long-term success of the Chavista movement and of this government, which has faced so much pressure, including violent pressure, assassination attempts, street riots, years and years of crushing sanctions. The success being that regime change has not occurred. There is no regime change. And you have a Chavista stalwart in acting President Delcy Rodriguez, who is committed to the vision of national sovereignty, who is president right now, who's also committed to returning Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores to Venezuela. You have Diosdado Cabello, who has been in the streets and is addressing the nation, who has the confidence of the military. The military structure is still in place. The defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, was not assassinated, as was said early on. The colectivos or the militant Chavistas are in the streets. And so if Trump has to deal with anyone, he has to deal with this movement because they control the institutions. And the evidence of a deal, leaving aside all of Trump's statements, which we can talk about later, I've been kind of saying that it's better to let actions speak louder than words when we look at any deal making. And the Venezuelan government has today announced that it's releasing quote unquote political prisoners. And when you think about political prisoners, these are often people who plotted violent riots, who carried out violence, who plotted coups, who were essentially members of a US-backed opposition that the US would never tolerate in its own territory, because the US would never tolerate people who are funded and trained by foreign countries, especially countries more powerful than its own, to conduct subversive and insurrectionist activities on their own soil. But that's what Venezuela is mostly dealing with when it's dealing with political prisoners. And there may have been some people there who got a bad rap and who were unfairly treated, but I don't have the names. And you know who else didn't have the names until very recently? Was the United States government. And we know this because Trump's envoy to Venezuela, Rick Grenell, who was in Caracas like a year ago, negotiating directly with Nicolas Maduro for a deal, which would have extended Chevron's drilling license in exchange for Venezuela accepting deportees, Venezuelan migrants from the U.S., Rick Grenell has come out and said that it was the radical U.S.-backed opposition led by Maria Corina Machado, which failed to provide the names of the political prisoners, quote unquote, political prisoners it sought, to make a deal possible, because they did not actually want a deal and they didn't want to allow the Trump administration to negotiate directly with Maduro. Their whole game was to delegitimize Maduro, not allow Venezuela to make a deal that would even let their own people out from prison, let them out from the supposed quote unquote torture centers. So if they were being tortured so horribly and treated so badly, why wouldn't you immediately treat this like an emergency and get them out? It's because you are a cynical sociopath. And Marco Rubio was part of that process of obstructing a deal at that time, which is why Marco Rubio did something even more sadistic, which is to, instead of directing a plane of Venezuelan migrants to be deported directly to Caracas, he sent the plane without any negotiations completed to El Salvador, to his buddy, the local comprador strongman, self-described world's coolest dictator, Nayib Bukele. This is last March 2025, like right when Trump had come into power for the second time. And they were sent to the CCOT actual torture prison. and they were publicly humiliated coming out of the plane, portrayed as terrorists when less than 50% of them had ever been convicted of any crime, and only 3 of them out of 250 had ever been convicted of a violent crime. They had their heads shaved on camera. They were beaten and pushed around on camera. Then they went into the prison with MS-13 members where guards brutalized them. And when they came out, some of them testified to 60 Minutes about what took place, our supposedly premier investigative broadcast magazine show. And Trump lackey or Trump toady Barry Weiss spiked the broadcast because it was so embarrassing to Rubio and Trump advisor Stephen Miller. But why did Rubio do that? Why did he have these Venezuelan migrants tortured by his boy, Bukele? Because he couldn't allow them to go back to Venezuela, because once again, that would allow direct negotiations. And so now that Maduro, that's one reason. And it would also allow Venezuela to have revenue through the extension of Chevron's drilling license. And there's more to it. I just don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole. That really exposes how sick this administration is. But Grinnell was sidelined. And by doing so, for months, they prepared this operation, which it starts with mass deportations, labeling all the Venezuelan migrants as, enemies of the United States who are connected to a gang, Tren de Aragua, which actually had no connection to Maduro, but supposedly was part of a foreign invasion. And that paves the way for them to begin to prepare an invasion of Venezuela. January 3rd, they kidnap Maduro, remove the head of state, and now they suddenly have a deal where these quote unquote political prisoners come out. And I think that's part of a larger deal. Trump has said that the larger deal includes Venezuela agreeing to sell 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the US. The US buys it straight from Venezuela, and then the state gets the revenue on the condition that they use it to buy American products, which will supposedly boost the US economy. Trump has done this before, but there's another crazy, I would say, disturbing aspect to that part of the deal, and I don't know if that part of the deal has actually been authorized by Caracas. And that's that the money will not be held in the US Treasury, which is supposedly accountable to the US public. It's going to be held in offshore accounts, which means Trump Incorporated could plunder the money. The CIA could use it for black operations. It would just basically become a Trump world slush fund that would exist outside the control of any ostensibly democratic institution. And so they're clearly up to something very devious and very revealing about what Trump wants in Venezuela and what this is all about. And at its base, for Trump and his cronies, it's just about plunder. It's just about money. That's what Trump's golden age is all about. Trump's golden age is just about maximizing the profits off the carcasses of global capitalism for Trump and his inner circle of militant Zionist 0.1 percenters, and imposing a regime of terror across the Americas to pulverize any force that might get in the way from Minneapolis to Caracas. We're witnessing it all play out right now. And Venezuela, while they still are asserting their sovereignty, the Chavista movement and the Bolivarian government, because of the military collapse they experienced on January 3rd, because of the overwhelming preponderance of force that the U.S. has in its hemisphere and its capacity for perpetual kinetic action against any target, they do have to make a deal here. But Maduro was always open to that deal. Maduro would have made the deal. For whatever reason, they just couldn't allow it to be made with him.
It's hard to see what all of this plunder has to do with narco-terrorism. I think they strayed a bit away from the plot. But in terms of the deal making, it seems as if the deals would have to cover a larger ground because Trump said, we are now running Venezuela. But this is a bit strange because they only kidnapped the president and killed some people. It's unclear. They're not controlling the government. But he then made this comment that the acting president Rodriguez could keep her position if she would do as she's told. And of course, you have this. He's tweeting out about this oil deal, uh, but unless they're going to go in full strength, do something like Iraq, which doesn't seem to be something Trump wants to do. I think he prefers the low-hanging fruit, but to get what he wants through threats and a bit of bombing. But what kind of deal making do you think he would be after? Because it seems like he wants to pressure the Venezuelan government to kind of accept how to run the country. So, in other words, they can run the country as long as it's on his orders. But what he demands seems to be a bit too much. It's not just Gisela some oil. He's talking about cutting off Venezuela from China, Russia, other partners, essentially becoming the exclusive gas station of the United States. But um, do you know any? Have you heard any of this kind of deal? What they're um, trying to reach? Because if you listen to Trump, it sounds like they already conquered Venezuela.
Well, I think in my last really extended answer, I said everything I knew about what is public and any aspect of negotiations between Caracas and Washington that are public have been disclosed, but there will certainly be more. And as you said, Trump's demands of Caracas are onerous, and he is certainly asking too much. His claim to own Venezuela's oil is not just exaggerated, it's false because there has not been a regime change. And he cannot tell Delcy Rodriguez to do whatever he wants because behind Delcy Rodriguez are the institutions of the state. And Trump has two options. He can negotiate with Delcy Rodriguez, who, like Nicolas Maduro, is a deal maker and does not want her country to be destroyed. She's a Venezuelan patriot who does not want to see this Venezuela descend into the kind of decades-long civil crisis, civil war that Colombia did, or destabilization, as we saw in Libya. Trump and Rubio do not have an exogenous enemy force to arm and weaponize against the Chavista movement inside Venezuela as they did with Mohammed Jolani, aka Ahmed al-Sharaa in Syria, who operated behind the fake cover of moderate rebels. Or like if you were a Trotskyist, you thought like there were these like democratic anarchists, like local action people who were going to storm into Damascus, but they don't have that in Venezuela. They tried the violent riots known as guarimbas. That failed. They tried Juan Guaido and the quote unquote humanitarian intervention with USAID. That failed. Everything they tried has failed until now, and they've gotten some leverage with this military raid. They killed a lot of people. Is kind of an Israeli style operation. But if they continue to attack Caracas and continue to pulverize the country, it will be destabilized. And this is a point that Jorge Ariasa, the former foreign minister, made to me in our interview, which is that with us in power, we guarantee stability. We keep the peace. So you have to deal with us. So Trump does not own Venezuela. Venezuela owns Venezuela. And since Hugo Chavez restructured the managerial structure, first of all, of PDVSA, kicked out the opposition managers back in 2005, and then tried to push ExxonMobil to play by his rules, which meant make a win-win deal where, Venezuela gets a portion of the revenue from the oil you pump from its own soil. Since then, Venezuela has that's when Venezuela finally controlled Venezuela. That's really what the Bolivarian Revolution was about. At its base, it is a nationalist revolution. You can see it as socialist because it took inspiration from Cuba in its symbols and its concepts in the comunas and cooperativos that they have established throughout the country, and in some of the economic nationalization that especially occurred under Chavez. But it's basically just a nationalist revolution to control their own resources, and it makes Venezuela a strong country and a powerful player on the world stage by leading the vanguard of multipolarism. And I don't see this government, knowing the people who control it, shedding that model or the basic Bolivarian ideology. And the card they can put on the table is us or catastrophe, and we're in your hemisphere. And not that I see them threatening the United States with migrants. It's just a reality that if Venezuela is destabilized, there will be another massive wave of migration. And the region will be destabilized. South America will be destabilized if there's a civil war. We saw that take place in Colombia. And that's why I think the Cuban Americans in the Trump administration, Marco Rubio being the kind of front man for this cadre, but behind him is a fairly radical Cuban American who's dedicated himself. Like his life mission is regime change in Havana. His name is Mauricio Claver Caron. That's why I think they sidelined Maria Corina Machado, because in order to bring Maria Corina Machado to power, and they've pretty much said this publicly, they would have had to have militarily occupied Venezuela with US troops. They would have had to have destroyed the Venezuelan military, which is not a neo-colonial military trained in the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, like all the militaries of the Comprador strongman countries across the region. They would have had to have killed lots and lots of people. It would have been bloodshed. And they understood there's a more elegant way of doing this. And so they kicked her to the curb. Many of the Democrats who had gotten behind her are furious. The human rights industrial complex is furious. They thought she was some kind of democratic hero. They're mad that, Trump did all this without caring about democracy or human rights. The whole cover of the regime change lobby in Venezuela has been lifted, and we can see that it's just about oil now. It's just about resources. It's just about raw, kind of raw Monroe Doctrine neocolonialism interpreted through the kind of cretinous Don Rowe Doctrine model, and power politics, great state power politics. And so this is also, as you alluded, Glenn, a message to Russia and China. Trump is pushing Venezuela to roll back its ties with Russia and China. And Russia and China have already been challenged Russia directly through Trump's seizure of the Marinera, which was known as the Bella 1 tanker in the North Atlantic, in coordination with probably the front line of the anti-Russian NATO alliance, the UK. They worked together to seize this runaway tanker, which belonged to Russia, which was carrying oil, I think, from Iran, but was not sanctioned. And it just essentially, it officially belonged to Russia, and Russia appeared to have been protecting it with submarines, but stood down to avoid a military clash with the United States. So what does that say about Trump's negotiations with Russia when he's willing to do that to implement the Don Rowe Doctrine? And then we saw President Xi of China having envoys in Miraflores Palace meeting with Nicolas Maduro just hours before he was kidnapped. And it was clearly a show of support for Venezuela. What happened to them? Were they given fair warning by the US that there was going to be this dangerous military assault? Clearly, it was a message to China as well, which has vast investments in the Orinoco Belt, the oil-rich region of Venezuela, and in Venezuelan minerals, construction, and across Latin America. It's a way of severing the Belt and Road from the Americas, and they're open. Trump is openly stating that Venezuela needs to basically be American property. This means, I think this has implications in the Sahel for Burkina Faso, which has adopted relations with Russia after having so much security instability under the de facto control of France and NATO. Message to Mali, all those countries, Niger, that have sought to adopt a more multipolar model and sought to exploit their own resources for the public good, sending a message to them. There's a message being sent to Iran, obviously, as well. Trump meeting with Lindsey Graham, holding a Make Iran Great Again hat in his hand, you know, embracing the image of neocon Don, the third coming of Bush's first term, of the second Bush's first term, and threatening Iran after he conducts this successful kinetic operation in Caracas, suggests that some kind of assault on Iran could be coming soon. And while I can't predict when it might take place, we have to consider that midterms are coming up and that the Democrats, as poorly as that party is being run inside the United States, are surging, and there is a very strong public. There's a lot of outrage across the U.S. public at Trump's behavior, at his policies. People are upset about the economy. They're upset about the unaffordability of goods, which is partially due to his tariffs. What took place in Minneapolis yesterday, where a 37-year-old mother was almost practically executed by an ICE officer, an ICE goon, shot almost point blank range while driving away in her car. A mother who appears to have simply just been living in the area and may not have even been an activist. This is a pivotal moment, I think, in Trump's second term that is leading him to electoral doom in the midterms. And that means that Israel and the forces that want to attack Iran are getting antsy, because without Trump, or without a strong Trump and a Republican Congress, it's going to be harder for them to, for example, avoid the kind of war powers resolution that was finally authorized today in the Senate to force Trump to go to Congress to authorize further military action against Venezuela. So what if a similar vote comes down on Iran? They don't want that. So they're angling for an attack possibly by February. There's actually been an anonymous account placing something like a $400,000 bet on Trump striking Iran, or Israel striking Iran, by January 31st. Was it an Israeli army insider? All kinds of money has been made off of Maria Corina Machado's various moves, including winning a Nobel Prize through insider trading on Polymarket. So this looks like more insider trading, and it's a good way to forecast events. I think if Iran were to attack Israel, like right now, as we're speaking, it would be by definition a preemptive attack.
Yeah, so war against Iran. Yeah, why not? They already said Greenland, Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, Colombia. So it's the list becoming quite long. I know that what bothered the Europeans, though, they really, we're always ready to support any wars by the United
Yeah.
States, but we were kind of hoping that the United States would lean into the whole liberal democratic justification. Just say that he's a dictator and you want to bring democracy and you have our full support. But Trump kept saying, no, we want their oil. And it kind of takes me to my last question about the legality of all of this, because I mean, even the rest of Maduro, did he do something wrong? Or what do they base it on? Do they have witnesses or evidence? And also the way he was taken. I know they have to refer to it as being arrested, but this is a kidnapping, and can you put a head of state in a court in New York? It just seems a bit of a contradiction. It seems very illegal, and Also, what happens if he's found innocent? Is it possible that they can allow this? What are they going to do? Send him back to Venezuela and say, "Sorry, we murdered all these people"? I just was wondering if you can say something about the legality of this whole issue and well, at least how they're presenting it as being illegal, or if they're just ignoring that altogether.
Great questions. Before I get to that, I want to make one point that I wanted to tack on to my last comments, which is that for the neoconservative movement in Washington that orchestrated the invasion of Iraq, and for the liberal humanitarian interventionists who orchestrated or provided the intellectual fodder through which the bombings of Yugoslavia, Libya, and the dirty war in Syria were developed in the name of kind of spreading democracy. They're experiencing a resurgence right now because of what happened in Venezuela. And they're proclaiming through Trump that they have finally overcome Iraq war syndrome. And that's what's so dangerous about this moment that we're in. The United States has the most powerful military in world history. It's a maritime power. It can conduct kinetic activity in the Western Hemisphere almost at any point. And few can challenge it in certain scenarios. The Achilles heel of the US military is that the American public is not historically accustomed to large amounts of casualties and hasn't been since the so-called greatest generation. The Vietnam War syndrome actually has not been broken. The Iraq War syndrome has not been broken because the American public has not been tested on losing large amounts of soldiers or even having a Black Hawk Down scenario, as was seen in Mogadishu, Somalia under Clinton. And I think if one helicopter had gone down of US soldiers in Caracas, it would have been an absolute disaster for Donald Trump. And this could take place in Iran. So it's something to keep in mind because this is one of the major debates taking place. I think like the major intellectual or ideological debates taking place in Washington, and it's taking place mostly within Republican Party circles. To the question of the legality of taking Nicolas Maduro, first of all, under an International Court of Justice decision, the Democratic Republic of Congo versus Belgium, it is illegal to kidnap a head of state and place him or her on trial in a national court. It has to be done through an ICC indictment, and then you bring them to The Hague. That's the procedure that has gotten Netanyahu indicted. So it would be, I would totally support any government in the world capturing Netanyahu and then taking out the rage of tens of thousands of families from Gaza who lost their children to him. And without anesthetic, because those children got none. Many children, thousands of children in Gaza got none without anesthesia. But that's not what's happening because it's not even something that has been tested in the rules-based post-World War II order. So what the Trump administration is doing by kidnapping Maduro and putting him on trial in the Southern District Court of New York is testing the entire post-World War order, and the case will determine whether international law exists anymore. I think most people watching this will say, well, yeah, it doesn't exist. We're in the law of the jungle. But that case will really put a nail in the coffin of international law if Maduro can be convicted. Donald Trump, the U.S. regime wanted to do the same thing to Julian Assange, kidnapping him, putting him on trial in a U.S. court, locking him away for the crime of journalism. The problem wasn't international law. The problem was the First Amendment, that he was just doing journalism. And he wasn't a U.S. citizen. Then, if you look deeper, if you look into the indictment, the narco-terrorism conspiracy is a complete fraud. The 2020 indictment of Maduro accused him of being the head of this cartel of the Suns, a supposed narco-terror criminal syndicate. that actually didn't exist. I've been saying for some time it didn't exist. And what's more, when it did exist, it was essentially a creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, which established its own drug conspiracy during the Reagan era when it began shipping cocaine into the United States through a network of Venezuelan National Guard generals that it controlled. It was essentially ordering them to send cocaine uncontrolled into the United States so the DEA supposedly could uh, establish, gather intelligence on drug trafficking networks in the US. When some DEA officials learned of this essentially criminal operation the CIA was running, they went to 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes exposed it along with the New York Times. They called it the Cartel of the Suns simply because those generals who were CIA assets wore suns as patches on their military uniforms. So they just keep bringing out this idea of the Cartel of the Suns just to attack Venezuela's government. We didn't hear the word Cartel of the Suns between that 60-minute special and probably 2014. And that's when the US government started putting the squeeze on the former head of military intelligence under Hugo Chavez as Nicolas Maduro came into power. His name was Hugo El Pollo Carvajal. They called him El Pollo because he kind of looks like a chicken. And he was accused of being the leader of this corrupt network of Venezuelan generals that were shipping cocaine into the US. And they just said, oh, the Cartel of the Suns. That was in his first indictment. He was arrested in Aruba in 2014, but got returned to Venezuela. Then they hit him with 2 more indictments in 2017. Carvajal goes from being the most loyal general of Chavez to denouncing Nicolas Maduro in public in Venezuela. Then he seeks asylum in Spain, the base of the anti-Chavista opposition. And in 2019, he sides with Juan Guaido and says, this is the real president. And so he's starting to position himself as this whistleblower from the inside of the deep state of Venezuela, who's a principled dissident, who can't take any more of Maduro's crimes. And at the same time, Marco Rubio announces Pollo Carvajal is coming to the US. We have extradited him and he will supply us with all the dirt we need to convict Nicolas Maduro. A bad day for the Maduro crime family. That's a public tweet by Senator Marco Rubio in 2019. So this was an operation and a process that had been put in place for some time. Carvajal was extradited from Spain in 2023. The US did everything to block him from getting asylum in Europe, to bring him to the Southern District Court in New York. And before the same judge who will preside over Maduro's trial this June, Carvajal was convicted of a narco-terror drug conspiracy, and he signed a secret plea deal with the Trump administration to provide dirt on Maduro, and in exchange, he gets his possibly 50-year sentence reduced to, it could be just a few years. All he has to do is be the star witness in the trial against Maduro, where he has pledged to Trump in a letter authored to Trump that he will provide evidence that Venezuela's Smartmatic voting machine company actually helped rig the 2020 election in favor of Joe Biden, indulging one of Donald Trump's favorite pet conspiracy theories. So that's the witness against Maduro. And this is how the United States Department of Justice finessed its case against Maduro as the US military developed an operation to steal Maduro from Caracas.
This is wild. This is how the rule of law is supposed to work.
It's one mafia against a phony narco-terror conspiracy. And this is really just like a sophisticated mafia operation. And you have to give them credit for pulling it off the way they did, but it's government by gangsterism.
Well, we spoke together about a month ago, and you said that this whole cartel de los solos was it was fake. And then 3 days ago, we now see after the attack, Washington Post comes out with an article as well saying, well, it's not an actual organization. So,
Yeah.
and you say same French TV as well. Yeah, France 24 saying the same thing. Is this an actual organization or is it made up? So, I recommend they should have listened to you instead. It's a bit
Well,
late to
the
come up with
DOJ,
this now.
the DOJ now acknowledges it. So in the new superseding indictment against Maduro that was unsealed on the day of the raid, when they got Maduro, the Cartel of the Suns is referred to simply as a loose network, whereas in the 2020 indictment, it's mentioned 32 times as a straight up cartel, like a real criminal syndicate. So they realized that that was that was going to be one of the weak points of their indictment. I'd question whether they also wanted to avoid discovery about the CIA shipping drugs, learning more about how the Cartel of the Suns was cover for that. And I have since learned something really interesting. This will be the first time I talk about it in any interview, and I'm still trying to nail down the details. But there's this one flight that is covered in the indictment that a flight that went from Venezuela's Simón Bolívar International Airport to Campeche, Mexico on a DC-9 jet, which is like kind of like a private plane containing tons of cocaine. And it is they allege that this jet was managed by Pollo Carvajal, and that behind the scenes, Diosdado Cabello, who is still in the Venezuelan government and is a defendant in the indictment of Maduro, oversaw this shipment of cocaine, which was intended for the U.S. Now, they had no evidence that any of that cocaine was actually going to the U.S. This was outside of U.S. jurisdiction, so that it could be thrown out on that basis. But the flight did occur. Some things that are not mentioned in the indictment. It looks like the flight stopped in a Colombian city for some time, which is where it may have picked up the cocaine. And the DC-9, known as Cocaine One, was owned by a U.S. company, which had exchanged hands with another U.S. company, whose owner was a Jeb Bush associate. And it appears very clear that this DC-9 was owned by some kind of CIA-linked shell company. And so Pollo Carvajal, Hugo Carvajal, when he made his defense in the Southern District Court of New York, confronted this allegation and actually sought to call as a witness the owner of the DC-9 jet. And Judge Hellerstein, who will preside over the Maduro trial, refused to allow that witness. That witness presumably would have or could have provided evidence or testimony showing that the CIA actually controlled that flight and was running it in order to compromise Venezuelan leadership from Carvajal on down. And so it looks to me like this judge will not allow further testimony that will expose the CIA, which is extremely unfortunate because I think the political context in which the assault on Venezuela has occurred over the last 25 years is really important in the defense of Maduro.
And this could be a very embarrassing trial.
Yeah.
Well, we ran out of time, so thank you very much for taking the time.